Amsterdam looked softer at dusk. Canals turning to mirrors, lights shimmering like liquid gold, bicycles gliding past like ghosts. I arrived that evening with a single suitcase and no plan, except to disappear into a city where no one knew me. After my breakup, I had promised myself I'd take a week off, somewhere far from the noise of my own life. Amsterdam seemed right. Clean, anonymous, quietly alive. For the first 2 days, I did the tourist things, walked the canals, drank bitter coffee, tried to convince myself I was enjoying the solitude. But loneliness is clever. It hides in daylight and waits until you're alone in your hotel room before climbing onto your chest. I'd been feeling that weight for months, ever since Alex left, ever since our home turned into a museum of things that used to mean something. That night, scrolling through my phone under the low hum of the hotel radiator, I saw an article mentioning an underground queer gathering called The Market. It wasn't a dating event, more like an experience. A place where strangers met under dim lights, stripped of names, stories, and expectations. The tone of the article was half intrigue, half warning. Freedom, it said, can feel like drowning if you've never been truly free. I closed the tab but couldn't stop thinking about it. The thought of walking into a place where no one would care who I was or what had happened to me felt both terrifying and strangely appealing. For years, I had lived measured, careful, predictable, even in love. Alex used to say I thought too much. Maybe he was right. Maybe that's why he left. By 9, I was pacing near the window, watching people on bicycles glide over the cobblestones, their laughter echoing faintly. Somewhere out there, that event was happening, strangers finding courage in the dark. I didn't want to join for lust. I just wanted to feel something other than the quiet ache that had followed me from city to city. I showered, changed into dark jeans and a black shirt, and looked at myself in the mirror. 32. Average height, ordinary face, the kind of man you'd forget 2 seconds after passing him. I wondered what people would see if they couldn't ask questions. If identity was reduced to breath, movement, touch, would I still be invisible? The venue's name, ironically, was the church. A reformed chapel turned nightclub in the center of Amsterdam. It was supposed to be one of the few places that could turn sin into sanctuary. As I walked through narrow streets, the air smelled of rain and beer. Groups of friends laughed under neon signs, couples held hands, and I caught myself envying them. Their certainty, their belonging. I followed the address into a quieter alley, where a faint bass line pulsed through the pavement. The sign above the door glowed faintly in red. The church. My heart raced. Outside, a few men stood smoking, talking softly in Dutch and English. They seemed calm, easy, confident. I lingered across the street for a moment, pretending to check my phone, just watching them. Some were laughing, others waiting alone. I wondered what brought them here. Heartbreak, boredom, curiosity. The same emptiness I felt. The line wasn't long. People went in one by one, handing their coats to a man at the entrance. I could hear the muffled rhythm of music inside, low, slow, hypnotic. The air smelled faintly of incense and sweat. I took one last deep breath and crossed the street. At the door, the attendant looked at me, then at the list. "First time?" he asked. I nodded. He smiled knowingly. "You'll be fine. Everyone's nervous the first time." He handed me a small card with a simple message. "Respect all boundaries. Find your own." I stepped through the door. The air inside was warm, hazy, alive with dim light. Shadows moved through corridors like whispers. Some people were laughing quietly near the bar. Others stood alone, thoughtful, almost meditative. The music wasn't loud, just steady, like a pulse beneath the skin. I paused at the entrance, letting my eyes adjust. Everything about it felt dreamlike, surreal, and strangely calm. This wasn't about chaos or excess. It was something else, something older. A ritual, maybe. Someone brushed past me, murmured, "Excuse me," and disappeared into the fog of light. My heart kept thudding. Every instinct told me to turn around, to walk out, to find a safer kind of loneliness. But another voice, quieter, deeper, said to stay. I watched a pair of strangers pass by, their hands brushing briefly before separating again. That small gesture, fleeting and unspoken, hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't about desire. It was about being seen. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the faintest spark of curiosity about myself, about what I wanted, who I could be without fear. I moved toward the bar, ordered a drink, and leaned against the cool metal counter. The bartender gave a half smile, the kind people give when they've seen every kind of story unfold in front of them. "First night?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Is it intense?" He shrugged. "Depends on what you're looking for." I thought about that for a moment, sipping slowly. I wasn't looking for anyone specific. Not a hookup, not romance, not even closure. I was just tired of feeling numb. The music softened, and a low hum of conversation filled the space. People came and went. Laughter mingled with silence, the night breathing like a living thing. I glanced toward the hallway where the lights dimmed even further. Beyond it, shadows moved slowly, deliberate, quiet, like people learning to breathe underwater. I hesitated at the edge. Part of me wanted to step forward, to lose myself completely. Another part wanted to run, to hold on to the version of me that still knew the rules. And yet, standing there, between hesitation and heartbeat, something in me shifted. Maybe life was meant to be touched, not analyzed. Maybe healing wasn't found in safety but in surrender, not to someone else, but to the possibility of feeling again. I took one slow breath, exhaled, and stepped toward the unknown. As the door closed softly behind me, I caught my reflection in a narrow mirror. Eyes uncertain but alive, chest rising with quiet anticipation. I whispered to myself, half nervous, half exhilarated. I wasn't looking for love that night, just a reminder that I was still alive. An attendant by the inner door held out 2 folded scarves on her palms as if they were offerings. One white, one red. The fabric caught the low light and drank it, matte and soft. She didn't make a speech, just smiled and said, "Choose what feels true for tonight." Her voice was practical, almost gentle, like a librarian pointing to the right shelf. I knew before I reached for it. The white scarf sat there like a small promise. Boundaries, caution, a line I could hold if the night rushed me faster than I could breathe. I took it and felt the cool weave against my fingers. The attendant tied it loosely around my wrist, not like a tag but like a reminder. "If you need water, a pause, or directions, ask any of us," she said, and then moved on to greet the next person with the same quiet welcome. Inside, the light softened even more. Fog drifted across the ceiling in slow tides, thinning and gathering with the beat of the music. It wasn't loud. It was low and steady, a pulse you felt under your ribs. Colored bulbs along the walls shifted through a patient spectrum. Amber, then dusk blue, then something warmer. The effect made time slippery. It felt less like entering a club and more like stepping into a ritual somebody had been practicing long before I arrived. People clustered in small constellations. A pair of friends leaned close at the bar, smiling into each other's words. 2 strangers touched forearms in greeting and then didn't know where to put their hands, so they laughed and let them fall to their sides. A tall man stood alone for minutes at a time, watching the room with a soft expression that looked a lot like hope. Everywhere I looked I saw the same mystery. Outward confidence stretched over private questions. We were all here for different reasons, but each reason had the same shape: loneliness in search of a softer name. A volunteer in a simple black shirt passed me a bottle of water. He had kind eyes and the posture of someone who trusted his own breath. "First time?" he asked. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled. "Only because you're still reading the room like it's a manual." He tapped his chest lightly. "This part is better than your eyes." Then, as if I might need permission to stand still, he added, "You don't have to move until you feel like moving. Everyone here just wants to be seen, even for a moment." I held his words like a handrail and drifted forward. The place opened in a series of rooms, each with its own temperature. The first space was social, low tables, a bar, a curl of conversation. The next narrowed into a corridor where shadows slipped past, the floor humming gently with bass. Somewhere deeper, A laugh rose like a bell, then dissolved into the music. I let my fingers trail the wall's velvet paint, rougher than it looked, and tried to memorize how the air felt on my skin. Warm, human, alive. In one corner, two strangers compared wrist scarves, one white, one red, smiling like conspirators. Beyond them, a woman with a clipboard checked on a pair seated on a bench, asking if they needed anything. I kept seeing tiny acts of care threaded through the anonymity. Someone passing water to a stranger, a hand hovering by another's shoulder to ask silently if touch was welcome, a volunteer pointing toward a quieter space when somebody's breath quickened. It struck me that rules here were not fences but language, ways to understand each other faster than words could travel. I moved on. In the amber room, fabric hung in wide strips from the ceiling, swaying when the air shifted. People stood beneath the ribbons and let them graze their hair, their arms, their shoulders, as if borrowing courage from the brush of cloth. In the blue room, the lighting cooled and the music thinned. There, conversation sounded closer to confession. I heard fragments float past. After the surgery, since the move. It wasn't love, but it was home for a while. Not one of those voices belonged to anyone I knew. Yet each sentence landed in me like a letter addressed to the wrong apartment that still somehow fit my life. At the edge of that room, I met his eyes for the first time. He was leaning against the doorway, relaxed without trying, the way people look when their body has found its balance. About my age, maybe a year or two either way. Dark hair cut short, a day's stubble, a faint scar near his lip like a comma that turned every expression into a pause. He noticed my glance and, with the smallest shrug, made a joke of the entire scene. "Surreal, right?" he said, turning his head to take in the blue-lit room, the fog, the measured music. Like someone designed a dream and we all got the calendar invite. I laughed before I meant to. The sound startled me. When you don't laugh for a long time, it sounds new in your own ears. "I kept waiting to wake up in customs," I said. "Explaining a white scarf to a border agent sounds like a long night." He grinned. "You'd be surprised what customs has seen." He gestured toward my wrist. "White looks good on you. Calm. Intentional. It looks like training wheels," I said, then winced at my own honesty. "Training wheels still move," he answered, not unkindly. "They just let you choose when to fall." There was nothing heavy in his voice. No push. No script he was trying to cast me in. Just a presence that made space. We stood there for a moment, letting the room move around us like a tide slipping past two rocks. He nodded toward the corridor. "Do you want to walk?" he asked. "I'm still learning the map." We wove back the way I'd come, and I showed him the amber room with its ribbons, the corridor with the velvet wall, the social space where laughter rose in clean notes. As we walked, we traded light facts the way strangers do when they don't want to interrogate each other's history. Where I was staying. How long he'd been in the city. Just a weekend. Whether the rain had made my shoes squeak. Only when I'm nervous. I admitted. Every answer felt like a small bridge laid across a river neither of us had named yet. At the bar, he ordered sparkling water and asked the bartender for extra lime. He slid one glass toward me with a small nod, like a toast without words. "What do I call you?" he asked after a beat. "Marcus," I said, and then, reflex more than lie, added, "Tonight." It wasn't my real name, not exactly. But in the market, real names felt like the only thing this place didn't owe us. He accepted it without a blink. "I'm Daniel," he said, and gave the tiniest half-smile, as if to admit we were both playing by the same rulebook. In any other room, false names might have felt like distance. Here they felt like mercy. We were protecting the versions of ourselves that still needed time. Music thickened and cooled. Around us, the crowd shifted. Some people settling where they were like stones in a riverbed. Others breaking off in twos and threes to explore the edges. I noticed Daniel, if that was his name, watched the room the way I did, with curiosity rather than hunger, as if he was mapping currents instead of chasing them. "Do you come to places like this often?" I asked. "Not often," he said, "but sometimes it's useful to be somewhere your story can't follow you. It gives your body a chance to speak first." The phrasing landed in me with the weight of a key sliding into the right lock. I had been narrating my life so loudly these last months, defending myself to my own reflection, explaining what went wrong, telling my friends I was fine, that I had forgotten what silence could do. Here, silence wasn't empty. It was luminous. It made room. We wandered again. In the corridor, a volunteer offered hand signals printed on a small card. Yes. No. Pause. More space. Simple gestures you could make without words if the music swallowed your voice. Daniel tucked the card into his pocket and looked at my wrist scarf. You can change your mind, he said softly. About anything. At any time. He didn't mean the color. Or he did, but also everything else. I tried to reply and found that my throat had tightened around a thought I hadn't let myself have. That I wanted to be here without performing bravery. That I wanted to be cautious without being ashamed of it. That maybe caution was not fear but care. We paused in a threshold where the fog thinned. The light swept across his face, fading from amber to blue and back again, and I noticed details I hadn't before. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the way he tilted his head when listening, as if catching words by their shadows. He asked where I was from, and I gave him the city but not the neighborhood. He offered me a country but no state. We matched each other's vagueness with a carefulness that felt more intimate than disclosure. A laugh rose from the bar, bright and brief. Someone cheered. Someone else clapped slowly, offbeat on purpose. I felt Daniel's sleeve brush my arm. Just a second, accidental or not, and the smallest electricity climbed my skin. I didn't step away. Surreal, I said again, smiling. Yeah, he said, but not untrue. We let that hang between us. The room exhaled. Somewhere nearby, an attendant refilled a bowl of mints with the same care you'd used to lay out candles. The fog gathered and released, like a sleeping animal dreaming itself into a different shape. I realized I was no longer standing at the edge of anything. I was in it, breathing, watching, present enough to notice how a live presence feels. The white scarf lay cool against my wrist, not a limit but a compass. I could go as far as I wanted and stop whenever I needed, and neither choice would say anything damning about who I was. Daniel turned to me then, and I met his gaze. The lights shifted to a warmer tone, and our faces moved closer by a fraction just because the room seemed to lean that way. He didn't smile or frown, didn't perform anything for me to read. He simply looked, steady and open, as if to ask a question without asking it aloud. For a long breath, the crowd blurred into strokes of color and sound. Only our 2 points stayed in focus. My eyes, his eyes, holding a line that felt both delicate and sure. No promises. No names, not really. Just recognition. In a place built on anonymity, that single look felt like a door clicking open. The first spark of connection, small and real, glowed between us in the dim light and refused to go out. It happened gradually, the way fatigue arrives at a crowded party. First my ears grew tired of separating music from voices. Then the lights, tender at first, began to feel like gentle hands tapping my shoulder too often. People shifted around me in soft currents, and I realized I was tracking every movement as if vigilance were a requirement for entry. I smiled at a joke I only half heard, nodded at a stranger who might have been nodding at someone behind me, and felt the room grow warmer by a degree I couldn't name. Pressure has a strange way of disguising itself as invitation. Nothing here demanded anything of me, yet my chest began to tighten with the sense that I should be doing more. Moving, talking, choosing. That old instinct returned, the one that confuses participation with worth. I set my glass down and slipped past a cluster by the bar, following the seam of the wall toward a dimmer space where the fog thinned and the music sounded like it was playing for someone else. The corner I found was not hidden, just quieter, like a page margin that had escaped annotation. The light there was patient and gray-blue. I leaned my shoulder to the wall, letting the cool paint soak through the cotton of my shirt, and tried the most radical gesture I knew, doing nothing. I let my breath arrive in slow measures. Inhale, a 2 count of stillness. Exhale. The room did not punish me for this. It moved around me with the same indifferent kindness as the canals outside, carrying what it carried. I wasn't alone for long. "Hey!" came a voice I already recognized, soft enough to belong to this part of the room. Daniel stood a pace away, hands easy at his sides, as if he had been looking for a map and had found one. "I thought you might drift this way." I smiled. "I'm not great in the middle of the crowd," I admitted. "I start thinking there's a test I forgot to study for." He stepped beside me and faced the room rather than me, a quiet courtesy that made it easy to stay put. "There isn't," he said. "Or if there is, I keep failing it on purpose." We watched the blue room breathe. People came and went in twos and threes, forming brief configurations that rearranged without friction. A volunteer crossed with a pitcher of water, refilled glasses, then vanished as if he'd been folded into the fog. Somewhere, the bartender laughed. One bright note, not the kind that needs an answer. "What brought you?" he asked after a moment. Not drilling for proof, just placing the question between us like something we could share ownership of. I searched for the clearest answer that wasn't a speech. "Noise," I said. "My life got loud, even when it was silent." I rolled the white scarf at my wrist between thumb and forefinger. I thought coming here might turn the volume into rhythm. "Does that make sense?" "It does," he said. "Loud doesn't have to be harsh if it keeps time with you." "And you?" I asked, glancing at him. "What are you escaping?" He huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. "Everything and nothing." He tilted his head, considering his own words before offering them. "Sometimes you need to be touched just to remember you're still here." He didn't look at me when he said it. He watched a couple pass by and greet a friend with a clasp of hands, as if his sentence belonged to them as much as to us. Something shifted in me then, something I had been pressing under a palm. The admission was simple and immense. It didn't reach for heat, only truth. I'd come expecting a place defined by appetite and found instead a place that made room for need, the ordinary, unglamorous need to be noticed by another living person and not be required to perform for it. I told him quietly about the breakup, not the angles or blame, just the aftermath. How the apartment turned into a museum of finished exhibits, how I learned to make dinner for one and tried to call it independence, how I woke sometimes to the sound of my own name in an empty room. He listened without arranging his face into sympathy. He kept his eyes soft, his posture unhurried, as if listening were a skill he had cultivated like a garden. When I trailed off, he nodded once and said, "I'm sorry." And the words didn't feel like a stamp so much as a hand on my shoulder. Steady in there, we slipped into a silence that didn't demand rescue. If I had known how rare that was, I might have taken a photograph of it with my mind. The two of us framed by blue light, our breaths coordinating without consultation. His sleeve brushed my arm and stayed there, a small line of contact that explained far more than language. The music stretched, thinner now, as if someone had pulled it like taffy, and the room's fog rolled through on a long exhale and receded again. "You ever notice?" I said, surprising myself. "How not being asked your last name can feel like being trusted, not avoided?" He turned his head, curious. "Say more." "I mean," I touched the scarf. "Without the whole biography, you're left with what? The way someone stands. Whether they make space or take it. Where they look when they laugh." I gestured toward the room. "It's terrifying. And honest." "Honest," he echoed. "I like that. Anonymity as accuracy." I let the phrase unspool. "Exactly. All the extra data we use to pretend we know people, jobs, schools, addresses, none of it guarantees understanding. But right now, I know how you breathe when the room gets loud." I paused, embarrassed by the intimacy of this observation, and he eased it with a smile I felt more than saw. "My friends say I breathe like a swimmer," he said. "Even on land." He tipped his head toward the bar. "I think you listen like a musician who stopped playing for a while but still counts time in fours." The comparison startled a laugh out of me. It was kinder than anything I had offered myself lately. Maybe that was the quiet miracle of this place. We were free to be specific about each other in ways that didn't trap us. A group drifted past, their laughter pulling us into a little eddy and then releasing us to the wall again. The back of Daniel's hand found the back of mine, not deliberate, not withdrawn. That small contact grounded me better than any speech could have. I noticed my body settle, shoulders unhooking, stomach softening, jaw forgetting to guard itself. We sat on the low bench built into the wall, shoulders touching now, an alignment that felt like listening with our bones. We didn't say much. A sentence here, an observation there. He told me he'd walked by the church a dozen times before deciding to step inside. Bravery arrives late for me, he said, but it usually finds parking. I told him about how I had read the article in my hotel and felt the idea stick to the inside of my chest like a note I wasn't ready to hear. And yet you came, he said, not as praise but as evidence. When anxiety rose, because it did even in the gentlest rooms, I noticed it and told him so. I feel like I should be doing more, I admitted. He nodded toward our joined shoulders. What if you already are? It wasn't a trick question. It was permission. That choosing stillness could be a kind of participation. We watched a man in a red scarf laugh with someone in white, both pointing at a sign on the wall with the hand signals printed cleanly across it. They practiced yes and pause like a language lesson and laughed when they got their choreography wrong. A volunteer corrected them with pantomimed grace. The scene made something unclench in me. We were not dangerous animals here, nor penitent sinners. We were people with bodies and boundaries, practicing how to say the right things even when we didn't use words. As the music shifted keys, I became aware of the finer details of Daniel's presence. The cadence of his inhale, the way his knee kept time against the bench, the faint scent of his soap, non-committal, clean, the kind you forget until the smallest wind returns it. I let my head tilt back to the wall and exhaled. And in that exhale, the day loosened its grip. My name, the one I wore outside, felt less like armor and more like clothing I could hang on a chair and put back on later. I like it here, I said, surprised to hear it spoken. Not because it's wild, because it's careful. Care is its own kind of wild, he said. Most places don't risk it. We let the thought settle. The crowd thinned and thickened in cycles, like tide on a clock. A man near us closed his eyes and rested his head in his hands. Someone else wordlessly passed him water and went on. I wasn't sure whether the night was late or midpoint. Time in the market folded around intention rather than schedule. A new uncertainty arrived. Not the fear of doing something wrong, but the fear of doing something right and having it change me. Daniel must have sensed the shift because he turned slightly so I could see his face without moving my head. He didn't ask what I was thinking. He asked, "How's your pulse?" I considered it. "Steady," I said, for the first time in a long while. He nodded as if I'd given the only report that mattered. "Then we're in the right place." A pair of strangers brushed past, apologizing in a whisper, and the wake of their movement carried a faint draft across our shoulders. Daniel's breath met mine for a moment, two metronomes aligning. The contact hummed under my skin. Not a demand, not even an invitation, just a reminder that my edges were real because something else could touch them. I thought about the last months, the rehearsed anecdotes, the careful presentations of being fine, the performances of independence I had put on like suits that never quite fit. None of those versions of me would have understood this. That a quiet bench in a blue room with a near stranger's shoulder against mine could return me to myself more completely than any victory I'd been chasing. He glanced at my wrist. "White suits you," he said again, echoing our earlier line but with a different meaning now. "It reads like a promise you're actually making to yourself." "It feels like one," I said. We didn't move for a long time. When we spoke, it was about nothing urgent. The food stall he'd found that afternoon near a canal, the way the bicycles seemed to float, the smell of rain on old brick. The pulse of connection thickened around the simplest details, as if we were testing how lightly we could hold them without dropping anything important. Every so often, our eyes met and then broke away, each glance a tug on a string stretched between us, tuning something we were both learning how to hear. Eventually, the music shifted warmer, and the lights followed, as if the room had returned from a long thought to find us still there. Daniel stood and offered a hand like a question. I took it and rose, feeling every place where my body met the world. We didn't go far, just 3 steps closer to the doorway, where the sound changed texture and we could see the larger room breathe. He looked at me then, fully. No performance. No angle. His eyes were steady and unguarded, holding a brightness that wasn't about the lights at all. The sensation that passed between us wasn't electricity. It was recognition, the kind that complicates and clarifies at the same time. We had not traded truths or signatures, and still a fact had appeared. We were each in our separate ways trying to arrive where we already were. I felt the urge to say something large and definitive and chose, instead, to breathe. He matched me. For a suspended second, the crowd blurred and the room gave us back our outline. Not lovers. Not strangers, not exactly. Two people learning the shape of a silence that didn't ask for rescue. The moment slipped, not because it failed but because it completed itself. He smiled, small and there. We began to walk, unhurried, side by side, shoulders finding each other again like magnets that had learned the path. Anonymity did not empty me here. It reversed the trick I'd been playing on myself for months. Without the scaffolding of biography, I was suddenly visible not to the room, but to the person inside my own skin. It felt absurd and miraculous, like recognizing your handwriting on a note you forgot you wrote. We paused at the threshold of the next room, light warming our faces, and I gave the feeling its first honest sentence. I didn't speak it aloud. I didn't need to. The line formed cleanly in my head, the only conclusion the night had earned so far. In a place where names didn't matter, he made me remember mine. We took the narrow stairs at the back, the kind that made you turn your shoulders sideways to pass. Each step creaked like a secret deciding whether to be told. Upstairs, the ceiling dipped lower and the sound changed character. Music became suggestion, voices turned to echoes. The air felt cooler in that way attics do, as if the building were keeping a calmer breath for itself. There were fewer people here. A pair sat knee to knee by a window, their silhouettes outlined by the streetlights below. Another pair stood in the hall, exchanging sentences with long pauses in between, like they were testing whether talking was still necessary. Along the far wall, a gilt-framed mirror stretched from waist to ceiling, its surface fogged at the edges by the night's humidity. It faced a banquette covered in dark fabric that had absorbed more stories than anyone could recount. Daniel touched my elbow, not to steer, just to indicate a direction, and we drifted toward the banquette. I sat, then realized the mirror took me in whole. The person reflected there looked familiar and unedited in a way I wasn't ready for. Bare-faced, imperfect, posture halfway between guard and surrender. The white scarf at my wrist read brighter in the upstairs light. I couldn't pretend it was an accessory. It was a declaration, even if I hadn't meant it to be. "You okay?" Daniel asked, reading the tilt of my chin rather than my silence. I held his gaze a second longer than I usually hold anyone's. "I don't know if I like who I am in that mirror," I said, surprising myself with the speed of the admission. "He looks undecided." Daniel studied our reflections as if they were a second conversation layered over the first. "He looks present," he said. "That's rarer than decisive." I let out a small breath. The mirror made it impossible to narrate myself the way I preferred. Polished, slightly detached, wry enough to pass as self-aware. The person in the glass looked like someone who had misplaced his script. Words came before I could tidy them. "I'm not adventurous," I said. "Not really. Not confident either. Control is how I keep from splintering. If I set the terms, I don't have to find out what I can't handle." He didn't rush to contradict me, and I loved him for that, or loved the kindness of not being contradicted. He angled his body so that we shared the mirror rather than competed for it. "Everyone wears a kind of mask," he said at last. "Some you can see, some you can't. Courage isn't never wearing one. It's letting someone notice what lives underneath, for a moment, without closing the door." The phrasing reached something old in me, something I used to trust. Let someone notice. Not confess everything, not perform honesty like spectacle. Just allow a glimpse where there hadn't been one. "What do you hide?" I asked. He smiled at our doubled faces. "I hide that I get lonely in rooms full of people," he said. "That I go quiet when I want to be chosen. That I choose caution and call it taste." He tapped his chest lightly. And I hide that I still want soft things, even when I pretend I'm built only for sturdy ones. We let the list sit between us. The upstairs room hummed with small mercies, a laugh that didn't demand an answer, a cup placed quietly on a table, footsteps passing without urgency. In the mirror's frame, the two of us looked almost like the idea of two people rather than the weight of them. I felt a strange warmth for my reflection, the way you might feel for a friend who tried her best and came up short but still showed up to clean the kitchen. "What did your last love teach you?" he asked, not prying, just organizing our talk into a shape. "That I used gratitude as a shield," I said. "I kept saying thank you for being here, thank you for choosing me, thank you for staying, and I forgot to ask for what I wanted after that. Gratitude is good. It's just not meant to be furniture. You can't live on it." He nodded slowly. "Mine taught me I mistake intensity for certainty," he said. "When things were loud, I felt sure. When things were quiet, I thought we were failing. How did it end?" "Gently," he said, and his voice made the words sound like a country somebody could be from. "We tried to be kind, and we were, but kindness couldn't hold what we were placing on it." I looked back at the mirror. The lighting shifted warmer, and my face changed with it, less like a question, more like a page with enough margins to make notes. I noticed the slope of my shoulders and set them down an inch. The floor under us was solid in the way old buildings can be, wood that had already learned to forgive weight. "What does freedom mean to you?" I asked, because the night had already granted us this kind of syllabus. He thought long enough to make the answer honest. "That I can tell the truth without losing my place," he said. "And that I can choose tenderness without being embarrassed by the choice." I considered my own. "Freedom is believing I'm not a burden," I said. "That asking for pace or space isn't me asking the world to carry me. It's me agreeing to carry myself." He made a small sound, approval maybe, and our eyes met where the mirror kept us side by side even when we turned. The upstairs room exhaled again. Someone's joke drifted up from the stairs, became a smile 2 rooms away, then dissolved without leaving a stain. I felt the space in my chest open in increments, like a window you test against a swollen frame until it remembers how to slide. We spoke then not as strangers but as people who had stepped into a slower current together. We named the small regrets we kept rehearsing in case they ever changed their ending. The text left unsent. The visit delayed until it was too late. The apology delivered so carefully it never touched the person it was meant for. He told me about the time he stayed an extra hour in a parking lot after a fight just to practice being calm before going inside. I told him about learning to cook for one and setting 2 places anyway, then clearing the second plate as if clearing a stage. "What do you hope for now?" he asked. "A day that doesn't ask me to perform resilience," I said. "The kind that remembers joy is a muscle, not a miracle." "And you," I added. "Company that feels like rest," he said. "Not escape, not rescue, rest." The word thudded gently somewhere near my ribs. Rest. I remembered being a child in a back seat, watching telephone wires dip between poles, letting the rhythm of it calm me without having to name the mechanism. Could grown men learn that kind of calm again, with each other? Could a night like this teach something other than appetite? A quiet spread. The music below slowed to a measured loop. The mirror held us as if it had been built for this angle, the side of my face next to the side of his, our chests taking turns lifting, a small gap between our knees like a comma in a sentence we hadn't finished writing. My hand settled on the banquette, and his settled near it, and in a moment our fingers were close enough to share temperature. We didn't lace them. We didn't need to. Contact became suggestion, and suggestion became a kind of vow. I am here, and I am not asking the world to be different to prove it. "Do you ever worry?" I asked softly. "That you'll dismantle the mask and find there's nothing underneath?" He shook his head. "There's always something underneath," he said. "Even if it's only the person who built the mask to begin with. That person deserves air." I tried those words on. They fit. The mirror made me brave in a particular way. Not to reveal, but to witness. I watched myself watch him, and there was no critique to manage, no choreography to correct. It was the kind of seeing that doesn't sharpen, it softens, that doesn't inventory, it includes. For the first time in a long while, I felt in step with my own breath. We let our shoulders find each other until there was no space left for air to argue. The contact was simple and exact, 2 lines becoming 1 line where they met. I could hear his heartbeat when the music thinned to a whisper, and he could hear mine when I tilted my head just enough that we shared a horizon. The entire night narrowed to that. Pulse against pulse, chest to chest, neither of us taking more than we offered. We didn't speak. The attic's quiet was full but not crowded, like a sanctuary that stays unlocked even when services are over. I studied the particular quiet made by shared weight, the way your body stops bracing when another person's outline agrees to hold a corner you didn't realize you were holding alone. Downstairs, something shifted. The clink of glassware. A door sighing open and closed, staff voices soft in the language of endings. Up here, time stalled long enough for me to make a small inventory of truths I could carry without breaking. I did not have to be new to be worthy. I did not have to be loud to be real. I did not have to be brave to be seen. I only had to remain. In the mirror, our 2 figures looked less like doubled strangers and more like a study in quiet proximity. Not conquering, not confessing, just continuing. I noticed the line of my mouth and how it had relaxed into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not. The person reflected there did not look undecided anymore. He looked unhurried. Daniel breathed in. I breathed out. Our pulses answered each other like 2 metronomes agreeing on a tempo. Maybe that was freedom. Not the absence of structure, but the presence of a rhythm chosen together. He shifted minutely so that our foreheads almost touched and then didn't. The restraint felt like its own intimacy. There would be other choices to make later, other rooms, other definitions. For now, the simplest one sufficed. We were here. I let my gaze return to the mirror and did not flinch at what I saw. The man in it was still me, hesitant, yes, cautious, yes, but the caution no longer looked like fear. It looked like care. The mask, if I had one, wasn't discarded on the floor. It was translucent, thinner than I'd believed, letting light through where I had expected only shadow. The music's last phrase turned itself over like a page. Somewhere downstairs, a volunteer laughed softly, and the sound traveled up the stairs as if reluctant to leave. We didn't move. We didn't need to ruin the moment by naming it. Breath, heartbeat, shoulder, mirror. Evidence, not explanation. And in that upstairs hush, with the city's lights sketching faint halos in the old glass and our bodies agreeing on a pace that asked for nothing and promised only presence, I found the sentence that fit the room exactly and fit me too. For the first time that night, I stopped pretending. By the time I noticed the hour, it no longer felt like night. The music downstairs had slowed to a heartbeat, and the fog lamps glowed softer, like they'd tired of performing. What had been charged with anticipation earlier now felt suspended between exhaustion and grace. Around us, the crowd thinned until only the people reluctant to leave remained. Moving slowly, voices gentler, smiles faint but real. Daniel and I hadn't moved far from our upstairs corner. We'd stopped talking somewhere between one song and the next, content to let quiet do the work for us. His shoulder still rested against mine, the kind of contact that forgets its own beginning. The mirror across from us caught 2 figures barely lit by the last of the amber lights. Still, calm, and unhurried. Eventually, someone downstairs announced closing time, their voice carrying through the old wooden beams like the bell at the end of a ceremony. People stirred, gathering scarves, finishing drinks, offering last nods of acknowledgement to those they might never see again. The spell was breaking in slow motion. Daniel turned to me. "We should probably go," he said. "Probably," I echoed, but neither of us stood up. We lingered another few minutes, each pretending the other hadn't yet made the first move. Finally, he rose and held out a hand. I took it. The warmth of his palm felt like memory already in the making. The staircase creaked under our steps, carrying us down into a room transformed. The music had stopped. The fog had settled. Volunteers were gathering glasses, wiping down counters. What earlier had been a theater of anonymity was now simply a room again, imperfect, ordinary, human. And somehow that made it even more beautiful. At the door, The attendant who had tied my white scarf smiled at me knowingly. "Did you find what you came for?" she asked, her tone light but sincere. I hesitated, then nodded. Something like that. She didn't ask more. She didn't need to. Outside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wet stone. A light drizzle had begun, misting the cobblestones until they shone like the surface of a dark canal. The street lamps painted halos on the ground, and the wind carried a laughter from somewhere distant. Tourists, maybe, or late-night friends who hadn't decided to call it a night yet. Daniel stepped beside me, hands in his pockets. We stood under the eave of the building, watching the drizzle fall. The silence between us was full, but not heavy. "It's quieter than I expected," he said. "Amsterdam always knows when to whisper," I replied. He smiled, the same small half-smile I'd seen reflected upstairs. Then he looked at me with something unreadable, half-tenderness, half-question. "Maybe we'll never see each other again." "Maybe," I said, meeting his gaze. "Maybe that's what makes this perfect." The sentence hung in the air, fragile and true. For a moment, neither of us looked away. There was no rush to capture it. No impulse to photograph or exchange numbers or promise impossible reunions. Just the quiet understanding that the night had already given us everything it was meant to. He reached out and brushed a thumb along my cheek, the gesture so simple it almost went unnoticed. His hand lingered there, not as possession but as gratitude. I caught it with my own and squeezed lightly. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For being kind," I said. "For seeing me without asking for proof." He shook his head. "You did that yourself. I just noticed." We both laughed softly at that, the sound dissolving into the drizzle. A couple of men exited behind us, laughing loudly, their voices echoing off the narrow walls. One of them waved to Daniel as they passed, a casual gesture of goodbye, the kind that happens between people who share a single evening and then never cross paths again. The door swung shut behind them, and the city returned to its quiet rhythm. We started walking, slow steps down the narrow lane. The puddles reflected the street lamps, stretching our silhouettes across the wet stones. I could hear the faint hum of bicycles somewhere in the distance, the mechanical click of gears turning. The city was breathing again, this time with the measured inhale of morning. Neither of us spoke for a while. Our hands brushed once, twice. The third time I let mine stay near his, not quite holding but not apart either. He looked ahead, then at me. "You look lighter," he said. "I feel emptied in the best way," I said. "Like something heavy just quietly decided to leave." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant. Maybe he did. When we reached the end of the street, where the canal opened and the night widened, we stopped. The water below caught the reflections of bridges and lamps, trembling with every raindrop. A small boat passed under an archway, its motor barely audible. Everything about the scene felt composed on purpose, as if the city had orchestrated it for this very moment. Daniel turned toward me, his voice almost lost to the wind. "This was good," he said. "Unexpected. Gentle." "Gentle?" I repeated, liking the way the words settled on my tongue. Not many things are anymore. We faced each other, just standing there in the drizzle. For a heartbeat, I thought he might kiss me, but he didn't, and somehow that was better. Instead, he lifted a hand again, this time brushing a damp strand of hair from my forehead. The gesture was careful, almost reverent, like closing the final page of a book you didn't realize you'd needed to read. "I don't know your real name," he said. I smiled. "Maybe that's for the best." He chuckled quietly. "Probably. Keeps the mystery intact." "Maybe mystery is the truest form of honesty," I said. "Or maybe it's the only way to be known without being owned." That made me smile. "You sound like a philosopher." "I'm just someone who listens too much," he said. "And I'm someone who thinks too much," I answered. "Then maybe it's good we met in the middle." We both laughed then. A soft, tired laughter that felt like exhaling the last of the night. A tram bell clanged somewhere far away, followed by the whir of wheels. Daniel looked down the street toward it, then back at me. "This is where I go left," he said. I gestured toward the opposite way. And I go right. He hesitated, then said, "You'll be okay?" "I think I already am," I said. That earned me another smile, wider this time, softer around the edges. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him even through the cool air. Then he did something that will stay with me longer than any kiss could have. He pressed his forehead gently against mine. No words, no pressure, just that quiet meeting of skin and breath. It lasted a second, maybe two, but it felt infinite. When he pulled back, he looked at me one last time, steady, certain, kind. "Good night, Marcus," he said, using the name I'd given him as if blessing it. "Good night," I said. "And thank you for the mirror." He nodded, not asking what I meant. Then he turned, hands in pockets again, and walked away down the wet street until his silhouette dissolved into the curve of the canal. I stood there a while longer watching the city wake. The drizzle had turned to a fine mist, and dawn was beginning to bleed into the edges of the sky. Somewhere, a window creaked open. Somewhere else, someone laughed softly in a language I didn't know. The world, unbothered by my small revelation, simply kept turning. When I finally started walking, I didn't check my phone or map the way back to my hotel. My steps found their own rhythm. I felt calm. Not the brittle calm of detachment, but the deep, quiet kind that comes from being seen without needing to explain. At the next bridge, I paused and looked down at my reflection in the canal. The water trembled, bending the shape of my face until I barely recognized it. And yet I smiled, because maybe that's what the night had been about, learning to accept the blur, to see myself even in distortion. As the first tram of the morning rumbled across the bridge, I turned and kept walking, the sound of the city slowly replacing the silence inside me. It wasn't love. It wasn't meant to be. It was something rarer, a glimpse of who I could still be. Morning came softly, like the city had decided to start over. The sky above Amsterdam was a pale wash of gray, still damp from the night before, and the canals shimmered faintly in the half-light. I hadn't slept, not from restlessness, but from a kind of fullness that refused to close its eyes. The room in my small hotel felt different somehow, the same furniture, the same dim lamp, but less hollow. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the faint steam rise from the mug of coffee I'd made from the machine by the window. My body was tired, but my mind felt quiet, finally unburdened of the noise it had carried for months. I looked at my reflection in the window, faint, translucent, merging with the city outside. I thought of the mirror upstairs at the market, the way I'd seen myself there without disguise, without the armor of certainty. It wasn't vanity that drew me to it. It was curiosity. The man looking back at me now felt like that reflection, imperfect but present. I got dressed slowly. No rush, no schedule. Just the rhythm of a morning that didn't ask for performance. The white scarf lay folded neatly on the chair, still faintly scented with smoke and warmth. I hesitated before picking it up. In the dim light, it looked almost luminous, soft, harmless, but full of story. I ran my thumb along its edge and smiled. It had started as a symbol of hesitation, a small shield I could hide behind. Now it felt like something else entirely, proof that boundaries could exist without fear, that openness didn't mean surrender. Outside, the city was waking. The narrow streets carried the scent of bread and rain. Bicycles clicked past in rhythmic procession, bells ringing softly in greeting to no one and everyone. Cafe owners lifted shutters, the scrape of metal against stone echoing like punctuation marks in the slow grammar of dawn. I followed the canal's curve, my reflection walking beside me in the water. The night before felt both distant and close, like something that had happened years ago, and yet was still unfolding quietly inside me. I thought of Daniel, not with longing, but with gratitude. His face had already begun to blur in memory, like fog softening the edges of a street lamp. But what he'd left behind wasn't his image. It was the feeling of being understood without translation. I realized then that not all connections are meant to last. Some exist purely to remind you what connection feels like. For the first time in a long time, that didn't make me sad. I passed a bakery where the windows fogged from the heat of the ovens inside. The baker, a woman with silver hair tied back in a scarf of her own, caught my eye and smiled. I smiled back, and for no reason at all, I felt something in me loosen. Maybe kindness, when noticed, multiplies itself. I crossed a bridge and paused halfway, leaning over the iron railing. The canal water rippled softly below, carrying fallen petals, cigarette butts, fragments of the night before. I wondered how many strangers had stood here, sorting their thoughts after something unnamed had changed them. Cities, I decided, are archives of moments like these, invisible footprints left by the people who came looking for pieces of themselves and quietly found them. I took a deep breath and felt the air fill my lungs like forgiveness. There was a bench nearby, empty and damp from the drizzle. I sat anyway, letting the chill seep through my jeans, reminding me I was still physical, still here. A gull landed a few feet away, cocked its head toward me, and waited, curious. "You missed a good night," I murmured to it, smiling. It didn't answer, of course. It just blinked, unimpressed, and flew off toward the water. But the absurdity of the moment made me laugh. A quiet, real laugh that came from the stomach, not the mask. The laughter faded into a long exhale. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small leather journal I carried when I traveled. The pages had been mostly blank for months, half-hearted entries, notes about hotels, lists of things to fix. I opened it to a clean page and hesitated, pen hovering. Then the words came, not neatly or poetically, but true. "Last night I went somewhere I didn't belong, or maybe somewhere I always did but never admitted. I didn't find lust. I didn't find love. I found presence. I met someone who reminded me that honesty isn't loud and connection doesn't need a future to matter. I remembered that I have a pulse, not because someone touched me, but because I let myself feel touched by the moment itself." I stopped there, the ink smudging slightly as my thumb brushed the edge of the page. I thought I came here to test my limits, but it wasn't about limits. It was about gentleness, about choosing not to disappear from my own story. I signed it only with the date, not my name. Some things don't need ownership. As I closed the journal, I felt the world settle into focus again. The air carried the sound of church bells somewhere beyond the canals, announcing an hour I didn't need to know. On the walk back to my hotel, the streets grew busier. Trams rattling awake, cyclists with coffee cups balanced precariously, voices calling out good mornings in Dutch, English, French. I blended into it easily. For once, I didn't feel like an observer looking through glass. I was part of the motion. At the corner near my hotel, a small flower stall had just opened. Buckets of tulips stood in every color imaginable, their petals still wet with dew. I bought a single white one, almost out of reflex, and carried it with me. It wasn't for anyone. I just wanted to hold something that lived in both fragility and resilience. Back in my room, I placed the tulip in the glass by the window, beside the cup of now-cold coffee. The scarf lay on the bed, waiting to be folded. I took my time with it, smoothing out the wrinkles, running my palm across the fabric as though sealing in the night it had witnessed. Then I folded it into a neat square and tucked it inside my suitcase, on top of my clothes. Not hidden, but protected. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a symbol of choice, of boundaries, of rediscovery. The scarf would remind me later, when routine returned, that change doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it slips in quietly through a door you were too afraid to open, carrying the simplest of lessons. You can start again, even from inside yourself. I sat on the edge of the bed again, feeling the weight of morning settle differently now. The room no longer felt like a holding space between destinations. Felt like a pause, deliberate and deserved. Through the window, the canal sparkled in the first clear stretch of daylight. A group of rowers moved through the water in perfect rhythm, their oars slicing the surface cleanly. For a moment I matched my breathing to their movement, inhale with the lift, exhale with the pull. I thought about how connection works like that too. Not constant but patterned, not forced but rhythmic. I realized something simple and profound: permanence isn't the measure of meaning. A connection can be brief and still infinite in its echo. Daniel and I had shared one night, one conversation, a handful of gestures. And yet, he had left behind a quiet map, a reminder that I didn't need to chase intensity to feel alive, only authenticity. That I didn't need love to feel seen, only presence, given and received freely. I picked up the journal again and added one final line beneath my earlier entry. The night didn't change who I am. It reminded me who I've been trying to be. I set the pen down and closed the cover. Outside, the city had fully awakened. The rhythm of day replaced the pulse of night, tram bells, bicycle chains, footsteps on wet stone. Life continued, unbothered, unchanged. But I knew something in me had shifted quietly into alignment. I had gone into that night searching for one thing, proof that desire still lived somewhere inside me. What I found was gentler and more enduring, proof that I did. I poured another cup of coffee, this time letting the warmth sit heavy in my palms. The window was still fogged from the early chill, so I wiped a small circle clear with the back of my hand. Through it, I watched the light bloom across the canal, faint gold stretching over rooftops, dissolving the last remnants of the dark. The scarf rested in my suitcase, folded neatly among my things. I could almost hear the quiet whisper of fabric when I closed the lid. A reminder waiting patiently for the next time I'd forget that life can still surprise you when you let it. As I zipped the suitcase, I caught my reflection once more in the glass of the window, softer this time, unguarded. My own eyes looking back at me, not for reassurance, but recognition. I smiled. I went to the market searching for desire, but I left with something deeper, proof that even in the dark, there's always someone who can see you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Before you go, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know where in the world this story found you.